Black Lives Matter is a human rights organization that supports racial equality. It's to end atrocities against the Black community in the USA. And inequity is basically rooted in American institutions from the long and painful history that started with enslavement long ago. So between 1525 and 1866, 12.5 million people were seized from Africa and sent to the US through the transatlantic slave trade. And only 10.7 million people survived the tormenting 2-month journey they were put through. Now, considering the life of the last known survivor of this slave trade was Matilda Mccrear. She was seized from West Africa and brought to the US. She arrived in Alabama in July 1860. And this was 50 years after the government had condemned the import of enslaved labor. Now, American society also illustrates the horrors of slavery in a very sanitized way, focusing on positive stories about Black leaders like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. Before 2018, Texas schools even taught that the Civil War was not just because of slavery and because of sectionalism or states' rights. And enslaved individuals were often falsely portrayed as loyal slaves. Now, racial, economic, and educational disparities are entrenched deeply in US institutions. Though the Declaration of Independence and states that all men are created equal, American democracy has historically and often violently excluded certain social or cultural or religious groups. Now, the occurrences of inequality can range from the obvious to the less overtly inequitable policies and belief systems. Some historical examples might include the poll taxes that effectively disenfranchised African American voters, or the marginalization of the African American soldiers. Black innovators were even barred from filing patents for their inventions. White medical professionals often exploited bodies of Black women. And there was a decade-long fight to legalize interracial marriage. And there was a lot of segregation in schools and government jobs or government positions. In addition to enduring centuries of enslavement, inequality, and exploitation, African Americans have long been the targets of racially charged physical violence. And Black Lives Matter may just be the largest movement in the history of USA. So now, understanding how this started. Yeah. So now, understanding how this movement originated, we have to look at the Trayvon Martin case. So Trayvon Martin was an African American from Florida, who was fatally shot by George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman was a 28-year-old Hispanic American police officer. Zimmerman had seen Trayvon Martin and contacted the Sanford Police Department and mentioned that there had been burglaries in that neighborhood, and told the dispatcher that he saw a really suspicious guy who was walking around. Now, Zimmerman also described Martin as someone who was up to no good or he was on drugs. The dispatcher specifically told Zimmerman not to follow Martin, but nevertheless, Zimmerman left his vehicle and followed Martin. Now, this was followed by a violent confrontation, and Zimmerman fired his weapon at Martin at a very close range, causing Martin's death. When the police arrived, Zimmerman argued that he had been assaulted by Martin, who was unarmed and fired in self-defense, concluding that they could not hold Zimmerman because there was no evidence against him. The police had to release him. And on July 13th, 2013, after more than 16 hours of deliberation, the jury declared Zimmerman not guilty. Martin's death heightened a debate over the persistence of racism in the United States, and in particular over the issue of racial profiling. Protests continued across the USA in the wake of the Zimmerman verdict and led to the formation of the prominent Black Lives Matter social movement, which focused on the better treatment of African Americans in all facets of American society. Another notable incident which had further strengthened the movement very recently was the George Floyd case. So on May 25th, 2020, which was a Monday morning, George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, was murdered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, while being arrested on suspicion of using a counterfeit $20 bill. During this arrest, a white police officer, Derek Chauvin, with the Minneapolis Police Department, knelt on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes after he was handcuffed and lying face down. The two other police officers, J. Alexander King and Thomas Lane, assisted Chauvin in restraining Floyd. And a fourth police officer, Tuo Thao, prevented bystanders from interfering in this arrest. Now, prior to being placed on the ground, Floyd had exhibited signs of anxiety and he was complaining about being claustrophobic and unable to breathe. And after being restrained, he became more distressed and he was complaining of breathing difficulties. And he said, the phrase, "I can't breathe," over 16 times. This was all because of the knee on Floyd's neck that Chauvin had placed, and he was also expressing his fear of imminent death. After several minutes, Floyd stopped talking. For the last couple of minutes, he lay motionless, and Officer Kyung was urged to check if he still had a pulse, uh, but he didn't find any pulse. But despite all of this, Chauvin ignored the pleas from the bystanders and everyone around to lift his knee from his neck until he was finally told to do so by the paramedics who finally arrived. The following day, after videos made by the bystanders, the witnesses, and security cameras became public, all the four officers were fired. Two autopsies found Floyd's death to be a homicide. Chauvin was later convicted of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. King, Lane, and Thao were charged with aiding, abetting, and second-degree murder. Chauvin's trial began on March 8th, 2021, and concluded on April 20th, 2021, while the trial of the other three officers is scheduled to begin on March 7th, 2022. On March 12th, 2021, Minneapolis agreed to pay $27 million to settle a wrongful death lawsuit brought up by Floyd's family. And on June 25th, 2021, Chauvin was sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison. Floyd's murder led to worldwide protests against police brutality, police racism, and lack of police accountability. In early June, the Minneapolis City Council voted an intent to restructure the police department as a new community-based system of public safety. Even statistics of racial bias in the police system will astound you. The police has killed over 1,000 people in America in 2019, and Black people are currently 3 times more likely to be killed by the police. And 99% of the killings done by the police between 2013 and 19 have not even resulted in criminal charges. Now we'll look at the view of the opposition in this movement. So the counter group argues with the statistics of a large number of people committing crimes were African Americans or Black people. And with the help of these facts, the opposition has justified to an extent that the reason for a higher number of Black people getting killed is because they are doing the crimes. Now, the supporters of the movement have questioned back with the data of wrongful convictions. 47% of the Black community is often wrongfully convicted and are also 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted for severe criminal charges such as murder, etc. Now we'll talk about the basic aspect of racism in this racial discrimination, which is institutional racism. This type of racism is basically reflected in our social and political mindset. It can be reflected in a number of aspects, and there can be several reasons for this. One of the biggest reason is, as I explained before, the enslavement, US's history. One second, the slide is stuck. Yeah. So Black Lives Matter activists seek to draw attention to various unfair treatment of Black people in this society, and methods that aid institutions, laws, and policies help to perpetuate that unfairness. The movement has fought racism through such means as nonviolent protests and through political aspects also. Now Black Lives Matter also seeks to combat police brutality as a focus, the over policing of minority neighborhoods, and the abuses committed by for profit jails. Its efforts have included calling for better training of police, greater accountability for police misconducts. They've also called for the defunding of the police department, which is basically the concept of reducing police funds and putting those freed up funds in community social services like mental health or conflict resolution programs. And BLM activists have also worked on voter registration and a campaign called Get Out the Vote in Black communities. Now, it's vital to focus on core issues, systematic inequities in the law enforcement that disproportionately and negatively affects people of color. And the sole fact that humanity has to clarify that any life matters is concerning enough. Black lives matter every day. Thank you.